When we see stagflation, we have to make a decision when it comes to policy. Do we want to close the output gap, or do we want to close the inflation gap? We cannot do both. Let's look at a policy response where we want to close the output gap, meaning we want to see Y go back towards Y sub P. So we want to see GDP go back towards potential GDP. Now remember, if this is policy, the only thing we can do is change the aggregate demand curve. We're going to be looking at monetary policy. So the way that they can do that is they're trying to close the output gap, meaning we're going to have to shift aggregate demand to the right to get us back to long run aggregate supply. So what we're trying to do is we're going to get this as aggregate demand. We'll call it sub C because it's going to be point C. And it's a rightward shift of aggregate demand. Well, that's going to cause us to get even further away from our inflation target. So if we close this output gap, how are we going to do this? Well, we're going to have to do expansionary monetary policy, which means we're going to have that R bar lower. That R bar lower means real interest rates will go down. So consumption, investment, net exports, all of those will go up. And we know if all of those go up, that's going to mean my aggregate demand curve shifts to the right, which we just saw. So what does this tell us? Well, I, again, like to start with aggregate demand, aggregate supply, so we know what points we're looking at. We also know then that this is going to go up, and this will be back to point A equals to C on the IS curve because there's no change in the IS curve. However, we do know over here on the left that inflation has to go up, right? Because we saw an increase in inflation, so we have to show that on the MP curve as well. So this ends up being our point because we'll see R come back down. So this point right here has to be point C. So now we know exactly where we have to put this MP curve, and everything should line up, right? Everything should line up. Here's my MP. We'll call it MPC because it has C associated with it. It's a decrease, a shift downward of the MP curve because we saw R bar decrease in this expansionary monetary policy. So notice what we ended up seeing, right? We close the output gap. So Y goes back to YP, but inflation is even higher than it was before. This is what we would call dovish policy. This would be a monetary policy dove. We are giving up some inflation to solve our output gap. So we're trying to get the unemployment down, but we're giving up some inflation. Notice that with a single policy, I cannot solve both. So the divine coincidence does not hold when we see a temporary negative supply shock. So again, this would be dovish policy because we're giving up some inflation to cure the unemployment problem of stagflation.